Hello, Andrew.
Right, hi. Yeah, I'm recording, Russell, so you're good to go. I'm Jill the host. I'm just out and about. So I've had to do some of my kids this afternoon. It's taking me a lot longer than I thought. So I'm going to make Jill the host, and then in fact, I'll stay the host on my...
Okay. I need to be able to share my screen, and I can't.
Can't share your screen. Wait.
Tell him what it says, Russell, what you read to me.
When I push share screen, it says host disabled.
Right now.
Attendee screen sharing.
Right now. Try now.
That worked, I think. Does that work?
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah.
Okay. Are we recording?
I'm recording, yeah.
Okay, here we go. Thank you. So this week we're going to be talking about Paris from the Belle Époque. Would everyone please mute? Everyone please mute. Everyone please mute. And turn off the video too. Okay, so we're going to be talking about this roughly 75-year period between one war with Germany, the Franco-Prussian War, that ended in 1871, and through a third war with Germany that ended in 1945, and was punctuated by the First World War, of course. We're going to talk about the Belle Époque, which preceded the First World War. I'm going to more or less divide it into two parts. One part is the part that was devoted more or less to repairing the damage caused by the Commune, and the second, and completing projects that had been initiated by Haussmann and Napoleon III. And then the second part of the Belle Époque. Please, would everyone turn on mute because there's some reverberation. If it can't be done, if it can't be done by Jill as host or Andrew as host, please individually mute. There are some people, Claudette, you are not on mute, for example. Alain, you're not on mute. So, and the second part of the Belle Époque is more or less after 1881, and everything really opened, 1889, it really opened up after 1889. So just to resume where we kind of left off at the last week. With his prefect, Haussmann, presided over a period of extraordinary growth in Paris, largely driven by industrialization, but also by the annexation in 1860, which doubled the size of Paris and added 400,000 people to the population of Paris from the 11 surrounding suburbs that were annexed in 1860. And resulted in the current system of 20 arrondissements that we all know today. During that Second Empire, an extraordinary number of percées with a C were constructed, both in the old part of Paris and especially in the annexed part of Paris to connect it with the central part of the city. And along virtually all of those percées were built immeubles haussmanniens with their very distinctive style. In fact, they were not all that different from the immeubles pré-haussmanniens, but one tell that's actually quite useful to know is that you'll see in a Haussmannien building, the shutters fold flat on the sides of the windows, so you can't see the shutters. They're either metal or wooden. Whereas pre-Haussmannien, the shutters lie flat against the facade of the building. And you can very clearly see that difference if you go down the Rue du Pont Louis-Philippe, right on the left bank at the end of the Pont Louis-Philippe, which was built by Rambuteau, and very much in a very consistent style, which shows exactly this type of building. The buildings, pre-Haussmannien and Haussmannien, were very different from the way people lived before. Actually, apartment buildings started to be built in Paris starting at the end of the 18th century. And this is a cutaway of one of the buildings from pre-Haussmann Paris, but it could be for Haussmann Paris as well. And it shows at the ground floor, the shopkeepers, the second floor, the wealthy who live on the étage noble, the third, fourth, and also fifth floors, other bourgeois who were doing rather well. And at the top floor, the domestics who work for the people below or other. So it was a bit of a microcosm of society in each Haussmannian building, very different, for example, from what was going on in England, in London at the same time, where most people lived in terraced houses, individual houses, and the rich tended to live in one area and the poor tended to live in another area. Thanks to this system, Haussmannian system, there was much more mixing of the social classes. Paris before the siege and the Commune, and then Paris during La Semaine Sanglante, where the communards set fire to important public buildings all across the city. And that's where we left it last week. So Haussmann was fired in 1870, and he was replaced by his right-hand man, Adolphe Alphon, who had been in charge of parks primarily during the Haussmann period, but he was made Directeur des Travaux de Paris. He did not replace Haussmann as prefect of the Seine, but he did replace him as the man responsible for building works in Paris for the next 20 years. And during that 20 years, he devoted himself to, number one, repairing the damage caused by the Commune, and number two, continuing projects that had been initiated under the Second Empire. So the Hôtel de Ville, which had been completely burned out and was a shell, was rebuilt over a 10-year period. It's actually bigger than the original version, but it very much followed the design of the original, the Renaissance design of El Bocador in the new version. The Cour de Cassation, the brand new Cour de Cassation, had been burnt out at the western end of the northern quay of the Ile de la Cité, and that was repaired. On the other side of the Ile de la Cité from the Cour de Cassation is the Quai des Orfèvres, and I'll just show you what it looked like before and after. So this is the west end near the Place Dauphine, where actually the Préfecture de Police was housed in these old buildings. And it's looking further down the Quai des Orfèvres towards Notre Dame, and you can see it's all older buildings still. All of that was replaced basically by two giant buildings. The first one on the left, which houses 36 Quai des Orfèvres, the famous 36 Quai des Orfèvres, built in 1875 to 1880, and then 25 years later, the Tribunal Correctionnel was built at the eastern end of the Quai des Orfèvres with its faux tower to mimic the Tour de l'Horloge on the other side of the Ile de la Cité. The Vendôme column that had been pulled down was rebuilt. It was the second column, but it was the fourth statue of Napoleon, this time as Caesar, and that is still standing. The Palais des Tuileries was left a shell, and in the distance you can see the Opéra Garnier. It was still standing in 1878, 7 years after the Commune, but it was ultimately demolished in 1882, creating the structure that we know today, where it's open-ended between the palace and the Jardin des Tuileries. The enormous Palais d'Orsay that had been built under Louis Philippe was demolished much later in 1898. And in its place was built the Gare d'Orsay. Perhaps the most impressive project, or certainly one of the most impressive projects that Haussmann started but did not finish, was the Opéra, which is no doubt, the Opéra Garnier is no doubt the most impressive and most notable of all the buildings built during the Haussmannian era. But what is sometimes not fully appreciated is that the Opéra Garnier is part of an architectural ensemble, which actually took 18 years to complete. Certainly, Opéra Garnier is the centerpiece, but there are 3 other very important architectural elements that all go together. So the Opéra Garnier under construction, finally finished, took 14 years to finish. There were a few interruptions along the way, notably because of the Commune. At the same time as the opera was built, the square, the Place de l'Opéra, was constructed in front of it. The next element was to build the Avenue Napoleon. But as you can see here from this wonderful picture looking from the rooftop of the opera, the Avenue Napoleon didn't get very far before construction came to a screeching halt with the end of the Second Empire. The arrow points to the tracé of where the Avenue Napoleon was supposed to be built, which required showing, this is a totally different angle, but what's interesting here is it just shows you the streets and the buildings that were in its path of the Avenue Napoleon and had to be expropriated to build the avenue and some of its neighboring streets. Finally, work resumed on the avenue in 1876 from both ends. You can see the opera in the distance there, and even further away now, until finally the Avenue de l'Opéra was, the name was changed from the Napoleon to de l'Opéra in 1873, because of course the Second Empire or anything to do with Napoleon was out of favor under Republican Paris. And it took another 2 years to complete the avenue, meaning that it took 2 years to build all of the magnificent immeubles haussmanniens that line the Avenue de l'Opéra. And much as the Rue de Louis Philippe perfectly epitomizes the pre-Haussmannian architecture, the Avenue de l'Opéra perfectly epitomizes the Haussmannian architecture. It's about a half a mile long, about 100 feet wide, a magnificent avenue which fulfilled the rule of Haussmann that he wanted perspective before any important monument. And this postcard shows something that is also sometimes little appreciated, which is at the bottom of the avenue. It just doesn't peter out. It is anchored by what was originally called the Place du Théâtre Français, but is now called the Place André Malraux. These 2 lovely fountains at the southern end of the diagonal Avenue de l'Opéra. which is still in its identical condition today. And an avenue in Paris is basically, one of the ways to define it is that avenues all are lined by trees, except the Avenue l'Opéra. And that is because Garnier didn't want any trees to interfere with the view of his magnificent opera house. And Haussmann wasn't there to object. So Garnier prevailed. This is my single favorite photo of the Ensemble Architectural because it shows not just the avenue and the square, but it shows the area surrounding the opera house and the square, and its remarkable geometric shape, its diamond shape. It's fascinating to see the horizontal here, the diagonal lines here, the rounded buildings that went into making this perfect square. They're one of many, one of a dozen magnificent squares in Paris built by Haussmann. So the roadworks did not stop with the Second Empire. They continued. And in blue, you can see that there are a lot more major roads per se built during the Third Republic. And I'm not going to go through them all, but you can see here that many of the most famous avenues and boulevards that we know today were built during the Third Republic after Haussmann departed. So on the political front, what happened after the Commune? Well, in 1872, building began on the Basilique du Sacré-Cœur, the Basilica of the Sacred Heart, to expiate the crimes of the Commune. The following year, France actually was able to finish paying off its war indemnity to Germany that it had agreed to pay in the peace treaty signed in Versailles in February 1871. 3 payments totaling 5 billion francs, which were financed by 2 domestic bond issues in 72 and 73. The 5 billion francs was equal to 2.5 times the annual national budget of France, or 25% of the annual GDP at that time, which amounted to the largest transfer of money from one country to another in history as a percentage of GDP. And then to kind of bring close to the Commune, the Third Republic in 1880 granted a general amnesty relating to all events due to the Commune, during the Commune. And at the same time, the 14 Juillet was designated as the national holiday of France. It is interesting to note that the 14 Juillet did not, which is commonly known as Bastille Day, did not celebrate the taking of the Bastille on the 14th of July, 1789, but rather the Fête de la Fédération of the first anniversary of the taking, on the first anniversary of the taking of the Bastille, which took place on the Champ de Mars and was attended by a staggering 400 to 600,000 Parisians, plus another 100,000 fédérés who made the trip from the provinces to see Louis XVI swear an oath to support the country. Anybody who's traveled, walks through Paris, constantly sees this sign, Défense d'afficher, loi du 29 juillet 1881. That was a law of the liberty, freedom of press. And among other things, they put in there that a law said, post no bills on any public buildings. You can only publish official notices on public buildings. So you will continue to see, even today, this sign, Défense d'afficher. So as I mentioned, the Basilique du Sacré-Cœur construction was started in 1872, but it wasn't finished until 1914. This is a picture of it kind of halfway, the construction halfway through 1895. So the Belle Époque period, in fact, was the beginning of what's known as Republican France, the Third Republic. Whereas the first two republics were extremely short-lived, very briefly during the Revolution, and then 1848 to 1851. The Third Republic lasted from 1871 until the German occupation and the Vichy government in 1940. And it was characterized by a number of points. The aristocracy had to move aside. The bourgeoisie became the dominant social class in France. And the three estates of the Ancien Regime, namely the clergy, the aristocracy, and the commoners, were replaced by the haute bourgeoisie, the petite bourgeoisie, and the classe ouvrière. And society was focused now on not your birthright, but meritocracy built on education. And largely that can be credited to Jules Ferry, who served both as Minister of Education and later as Prime Minister and President. He was in politics for a good long time. And he's most famous for his laws, what are called the Jules Ferry laws of 1881 and 1882, that made primary education in France free, laïque. The church was no longer responsible for education. It was a non-clerical education and mandatory. So on the cultural front, a mere 3 years after the commune and the destruction it wrought, the first of 8 Impressionist exhibitions was held. And in 1878, the third Universal exhibition was held. There was one in 1855, which was the instigation for the Grande Croisée. Then there was one in 1867 that we didn't really talk about. And now there's this one in 1878. One in 1867 took place on the Champ de Mars, and so did this one in 1878. And perhaps the centerpiece of this one was this wonderful wedding cake of a structure, a Moorish structure called the Palais De Tokyo, built on the Place de Tokyo in the 16th arrondissement, opposite where is now standing the Eiffel Tower. None of the buildings, unfortunately, from the 1855, 1867, or 1878 exhibitions exist. A number of public works projects took place during this time too, apart from finishing Haussmann's job. And one of them was the construction of the enormous post office on the Rue de Louvre. And this, we're pointing to it here. This giant structure is the largest post office in France. And you can see that it too was just part of an ensemble, and all of these dark roads had to be percés in order to create this plot. The Rue aux Ours was renamed the Rue Etienne Marcel in 1881. And you can see that it abuts in the Place des Victoires. And all of these changes, you can see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4. So one new road, and this can more or less be considered a new road on the top. And then the two other roads were widened. So fundamentally disfiguring, frankly, the Place des Victoires, which had been a much more uniform circle before these constructions took place. This is the Poste Centrale du Louvre, which closed a decade or more ago. It was unique because you could actually post letters there 24 hours a day, in addition to being simply the largest post office and mail distribution center in France. So right down the street, the Rue du Louvre, which was percée in order to create that lot for the post office, just down the street a little bit to the south was the Allée Bleue, which had been rebuilt by Napoleon. Well, it was rebuilt again to create the Bourse de Commerce, wonderful round building, soon to reopen as the Pinot exhibition space. Other public works projects that went on, the construction of the gigantic Sorbonne campus of the University of Paris along the Rue Saint-Jacques. And the Rue des Écoles. And that facade along the Rue des Écoles houses what's known as the Palais de l'Académie de Paris, which is quite magnificent, and it can be visited on Saturday mornings if you sign up in advance once all of this COVID-19 business is over. And in there is where you will find, for example, this wonderful portrait of Cardinal Richelieu, who was not only a student of the school, but also was its principal, préviseur. Other public works projects, the Galerie de Zoologie was built in the Jardin des Plantes, remodeled to make the Grande Galerie de l'Évolution. The Gare Saint-Lazare that we know was built. And the Musée Guimet was built as a museum on the Place d'Iéna in the 16th arrondissement. One of the most notable things that happened during this period before 1889, which is the second half of the Belle Époque, was the death of Victor Hugo. Now, Hugo was a famous, not only a great writer, but he was also very politically involved and was actually serving in the National Assembly during the Second Republic. And when Napoleon III staged his coup d'etat to become first consul, Hugo was outraged and went into self-exile in the Channel Islands, Jersey, then Guernsey. He returned to Paris after the Napoleon III was gone and was adulated for the rest of his life, to the point that when he died in 1885, he was given a state funeral, the likes of which had never been seen, maybe since the burial of Napoleon I's remains in the Dome Église. His casket was put on a structure called a catafalque below the Champs-Élysées, and then later was transported in a cortege down the Champs-Élysées all the way to the Pantheon, accompanied by 2 million Frenchmen. His remains were laid to rest in the Pantheon, which had actually started out as a church when it was built by Louis XV and Louis XVI. It was intended to be the Église Sainte-Geneviève. During the Revolution, it was turned into a mausoleum for the great men of France, and a number of revolutionary figures were buried there. Then after the Revolution, it became a church, and it went back and forth a couple of times. And finally, in 1881, it was made into an official mausoleum once again. But Victor Hugo was the first man to be buried there in 50 years. So it was more or less the redubbing of the Pantheon as a temple of great men. Marie Curie was the first woman to be buried there in 1995. So this begins the second part of what I call the heart of the Belle Époque, from 1889 to 1914, which was characterized by a departure from Haussmannism in many ways, and perhaps best characterized by l'Art Nouveau, which was the name of an art gallery created by the German-French exhibitor, art collector and seller, Siegfried Bing, who called his store the Maison de l'Art Nouveau in 1895. Things started to loosen up big time in 1889. The Moulin Rouge opened in Pigalle, featuring La Goulou dancing the can-can, as depicted by Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec in this characteristic poster. And artists flooded into Montmartre, above Pigalle, in particular Le Bateau Lavoir, which was consisted of 20 different studios where famous artists, well, later famous artists located. But 1889 was perhaps most famous, certainly most famous, for the Exposition Universelle, which celebrated 100 years since the Revolution. It took place once again on the Champ de Mars. And of course, its highlight was the Eiffel Tower. The foundations, first ironwork. In the distance, you can still see the Palais De Tokyo. Took 2 years, 2 months, and 5 days to build the Eiffel Tower, 1,063 feet tall. It was twice as tall as the next tallest structure at that time, which was the Washington Monument, which had been completed in 1888. And as you can see, it's this highlight of a very crowded Champ de Mars. So Haussmannism, it was one of its defining characteristics was the alignement. The buildings had to be lined up in a row, all on the street. All of the balconies had to line up. All of the rooftops had to line up. There was an extraordinary, the fellow was very linear. A lot of people did not like that. And finally, after 40 years, the alignement haussmannien was done away with, and it ceded the place to what was known as the picturesque style, where each building stood on its own. And the idea was to have variety, and you did not have to take into consideration that what your neighboring building looked like so much. One of the streets that best characterizes this style is the Champs-Élysées, depicted in this photo. Also, the Boulevard Raspail are supposed to be perhaps the two best examples of the picturesque style of architecture in Paris. An engineer named Hugo developed a new way of building buildings. Instead of building with stone, as had been done in the past, or he used reinforced concrete, béton armé, in what was known as the Système Hugo. And he built this building as the headquarters for his company, entirely made of reinforced concrete. including all of the moldings here. So you didn't have to carve the stone anymore. You could actually just pour concrete into a mold. And it's completely transformed. It was cheaper and faster to build this way. In the 1890s, English chic hit Paris. Three examples: the Old England men's store that was located on the ground floor of the Grand Hotel depicted in this photograph on the Boulevard des Capucines and the Rue Scribe arrived. And it stayed in that location, 1886 to 2011, finally closed in 2011. Maxime's on the Rue de la Paix, Fouquet's on the Avenue des Champs-Élysées. They were spelled with an apostrophe S and pronounced in the English fashion when they were created. On the cultural front, the wonderful play Cyrano de Bergerac by Edmond Rostand premiered at the Théâtre de la Porte Saint-Martin. Less nobly, the affaire Dreyfus rocked France for 12 years. Finally, Zola wrote his famous letter, J'accuse, which mobilized public opinion and ultimately ended in Dreyfus being reinstated in the army after the scandalous imprisonment. Things reached a peak in the Belle Époque with the Exposition Universelle of 1900. The fair in 78 had 16 million visitors. In 78, 16 million. In 89, 32 million. In 1900, 50 million visitors came. It was huge. Not only did it fill the entire Champ de Mars, but it filled the entire Esplanade des Invalides and the quays between them, as well as on the right bank, the area in front of the Palais de Tokyo and the area opposite the Esplanade des Invalides that you'll see in a minute. The entrance, the formal entrance, was on the Place de la Concorde, colorized version. Again, the Champ de Mars was completely jammed with pavilions, but the Palais de Tokyo was still standing from the 1878 fair. Along the left bank, between the Pont d'Iéna and the Pont des Invalides, what was known as the Quai des Nations. Here you see pictures of the Bateau Mouche. In fact, the Bateau Mouche began in 1867, and the name Mouche comes from the shipyard where they were constructed outside Lyon. The left bank with 3 pavilions, Belgium, Norway, and Germany. So the idea is to do something very typical and traditional. And they were all temporary. You could travel around on a rolling sidewalk, 2 speeds. The Pont Alexandre III was a gift from the Russian Tsar to Paris at this time, under construction, completed. It looks totally different from every other bridge in Paris. It is in fact modeled on a much larger version of the same bridge in St. Petersburg. The view downstream with the Quai des Nations on the left, and the view of the Grand Palais and the Petit Palais, both of which were constructed for the exposition of 1900. So it was basically, this is the beginning of time when all that's left from the exhibition of 1889 is the Eiffel Tower, and all its, but a number of buildings are left from the exhibition of 1900. Certainly the Grand Palais and the Petit Palais. The Champ de Mars, this is a view of it, with the Palais de l'Électricité in front of the École Militaire. The space that it covers is gigantic, much larger than it is today. And that is because it was much larger than it is today, the Champ de Mars. The arrows are pointing to these lightly shaded areas on either side of the Champ de Mars. They were in fact subdivided, sold and subdivided by the city of Paris in 1907. The roads that are alongside the Champ de Mars, the smaller roads, not the Avenue de la Bourdonnais over here, which was already existing, or not the Avenue de Suffren and the 15th arrondissement on the left, but these streets were built in 1907. And over the next 20 years, all the wonderful Hôtels Particuliers were built alongside them. Unlike the traditional Hôtel Particulier, however, they do not follow the format of cour, logis, jardin, because they had a very large garden right behind them. Other buildings built for the exhibition, the Gare d'Orsay took travelers right to the center of Paris. The Gare des Invalides, even closer. There was, in fact, an annex of the fair out in Versailles. I think it was it might have been Olympic Games, I'm not sure. In any event, the first metro line in Paris was built in 1900, the Line 1, that goes from the Rue De Rivoli, from the Place de l'Étoile to the Bastille and beyond. This is the Rue De Rivoli. Paris was fortunate because Haussmann had built these great percées, so they were wide and straight. And so to build the subways, they basically just took up the street and built the subway right underneath them. Much more complicated in London, which did not have these wide Haussmannian boulevards to build, so they actually had to tunnel. They also started their metro system about 30 years earlier than Paris. The Line 1 now, the Rue de Faubourg Saint-Antoine. You can see the Colonne de Juillet in the distance at the Place de la Bastille. Between 1900 and 1910, 1914, there were 10 more subway lines completed, including one that stopped in front of the Opera, the Place Saint-Michel, among others. Hector Guimard designed the iconic Art Nouveau subway entrances at that time, many of which still are standing, thank goodness. Art Nouveau is represented in the architecture in many ways, and including in the architecture of individual buildings, most prominently in the 7th and 16th arrondissement. There is a building built by the engineer Jules Lavirotte on the Avenue Rapp, right near the American Library, which is an amazingly organic Art Nouveau structure. And nearby, the Maison des Arends on the Rue du Champ de Mars. Very soon thereafter, the very first Art Deco building in Paris was built, the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées. More did not follow until after the war, but this was the first one. And right after it opened, literally a month or so after it opened, it held the premiere of The Rite of Spring by Igor Stravinsky, performed by the Ballet Russe, choreographed by Nijinsky, and it caused a scandal. Same year, the first of 7 volumes of Marcel Proust's epic In Search of Lost Time, sometimes translated as Remembrance of Things Past, was published. Proust lived all of his life in Paris in the 8th arrondissement. Interestingly, the last years at 102 Boulevard Haussmann, where he wrote in a cork-lined room. The end of the Belle Époque also saw the height of the construction of what are known in French as grands magasins, department stores. The department store arguably was invented by Aristide Boucicaut, who opened Au Bon Marché on the left bank on the Rue de Sèvres, Boulevard Raspail in 1869. And his model was followed by subsequently the magnificent store on the Boulevard Haussmann right behind the Opera, with its characteristic circular corner, kind of tower corner with a dome on it, built in 1909. The Galerie Lafayette, also on the Boulevard Haussmann, enormous, was built, the current one was built in 1912. And La Samaritaine on the Pont Neuf, the original store was built in 1910. There was an addition in 1928, which is what you can see from the quay. So this Art Deco building was built in 1928, but in 1910, the Art Nouveau section that you can see on the right here was built. This picture is from last November. And the Bazaar de l'Hôtel de Ville, right opposite the Hôtel de Ville with its magnificent dome, was built in 1913. It was during this period, 1914 to 1930, actually, that the Champs-Élysées was kind of reached its peak. It was the place to go for shopping and entertainment. There were showrooms for car makers. There were famous cinemas. In addition to cafes, it was really the place to be during that period. In the 1930s, offices started to move in and it lost a lot of its charm. Other major buildings built before the war, the Hotel Lutetia on the Boulevard Raspail, which was magnificently renovated. 1910, La Crue, flood. So when you walk around Paris and you see on buildings plaques that say Crue, Janvier 1910, those indicate the level that the flood waters reached, the highest level that the flood waters reached in the Great Flood of 1910. And in light blue here is indicated just how far the flood waters extended. They went all the way up to the Gare Saint-Lazare and the Gare de Lyon. Near the Gare de Lyon, you have the Avenue de Rivoli, the Rue d'Austerlitz, the Avenue Daumesnil, all underwater. Gare Saint-Michel flooded. And now we're going to kind of travel downstream with the flood. This is what the Pont Neuf looked like. And La Samaritaine is in the background, but not obviously the Art Deco facade. The Pont du Carrousel, the Rue du Bac, picture from Rue du Perron, the Rue de l'Université, in front of the Quai d'Orsay, the Gare d'Orsay, Pont des Invalides, the Zouave. So on the Pont de l'Alma, this is the old Pont de l'Alma. There are 4 soldiers in front of each of the pilings. And the Zouave, I hope I pointed to the right guy. Well, it's one of them, was used as a way to measure the height of the Seine. And the Zouave, as you can see, is pretty underwater. He's up to his shoulders here. This is the same guy in the Exposition Universelle of 1855, well out of the water, as you can see. So it reached the 28 feet above normal during the Great Flood of January 1910. It more or less receded during the month of February and was gone by March. The bridge was changed, but they kept the Zouave. He's the only one of the 4 soldiers that's still there, and he's not quite at the same height, but nevertheless, as recently as 2 years ago, the Seine was threatening to overflow once again. The reason why the flood waters reached as far as the Gare Saint-Lazare was because this dotted line shows the ancient route of the Seine, the Lys, the riverbed of the Seine in the old days, and we're talking thousands of years ago, went all the way out here, which is why this area was flooded and known as the Marais, marshy area, for so long. And it's still exposed to flooding, even with the higher embankments. Here is the River Bièvre, which comes out around the Gare d'Austerlitz. There was a channel cut off here that went down here to provide water to the Abbaye de Saint-Victor. It's not on the map. And that's why the Rue de Bièvre is here, because that's where the channel of the Rue de Bièvre was, where Mitterrand had his flat. But the principal river was here. And it unfortunately became completely unhealthy and unsanitary because there were tanneries located in Saint-Marcel, the suburb of Saint-Marcel, which would dump their refuse into the river, and gradually over between 1877 and 1912, it was covered over, and is totally covered over now. World War I arrived, 1914 to 1918, 1.4 million French died in the ghastly trench warfare. The Germans devised a big gun known as the Paris gun, or Grosse Berthe, which had a barrel, an enormous barrel, 112 feet long and a range of 75 miles, which they fired towards the end of the war on Paris, causing some damage, most famously during a Christmas service on Good Friday. A shell fell on the Église Saint-Gervais-Saint-Protais, killing 91 and wounding 68. But basically, Paris survived World War I unscathed. The period between the 2 wars, not a lot of construction went on here, but Paris was the cultural capital of the world and fun capital of the world. Even though construction of the Sacré-Cœur was finished in 1912, it wasn't consecrated until 1919. This is a 1909 photo. In 1921, the population of Paris reached its all-time peak, ironically, since it was right after a war, of 2.9 million. That's the green line down here. You can see that there are a lot of people ever since the 1870s, really, who started to move out of Paris. in the suburbs outside the Thiers fortification. Fashions changed. The young American Josephine Baker headlined at the Folies Bergère. Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, other American writers and artists moved to Montparnasse. And the artists like Picasso left Montmartre to join them. The action was on the Boulevard Montparnasse. The literary cafe par excellence was the Café du Dôme, which it was the first cafe to open there in 1898. La Coupole Brasserie. And another favorite hangout was La Closerie des Lilas, which was older, but it became very popular during the 1920s. During the pre-war period, there were a staggering number of deaths from tuberculosis. And it was determined that 40% of the deaths, people who died lived in 6.5% of the buildings. And in 1920, the health authorities identified 17 îlots insalubres or unsanitary zones where the greatest outbreaks had occurred. Most of them were in the Marais. And there was îlot insalubre number 1. So Le Corbusier, this was the beginning of urban planning, city planning. And the architect Le Corbusier, he proposed a plan to the city of Paris, which would take care of the îlot insalubre by raising the entire Marais and replacing it with these skyscrapers. Fortunately, it didn't happen. But what did happen was that the îlot insalubre number 1 was totally raised and created what was known as the Plateau Beaubourg, which remained like this for the next 40 years. Perhaps the most important development of the period between the two wars was that Paris started well, during the 10-year period, demolished the Thiers fortification that had been built in the 1840s. Remember, it was enormous. You had the fortification itself, which is on the right. You had a moat in front of it and a glacis for, I don't know, 200 meters or something like that, sloping down beyond it, which was not supposed to be constructed on. This is the Porte De Versailles, and you can even actually see this little area here. You can see how wide the area between what is now the Boulevard des Maréchaux and the Boulevard Périphérique, all around the entire rim of Paris. This opened up a vast new area for construction after the wall and surroundings were demolished. So just a shot of the wall on the left, the moat and the glacis with construction on it. A lot of construction did occur on the glacis and what was known as the zone. The worst of the zone was in the north. And this is what it looked like in Saint-Ouen. It was obviously just poor, desperate habitations. So it was demolished. Porte de Versailles. Well, Porte de Versailles, we all know it as being the exposition center where exhibitions are held. Well, it actually started that way once they demolished the wall. There is the Foire de Paris, which had actually started some years earlier, but it moved to the Porte de Versailles in 1924. It is the largest fair, general purpose fair in Europe. And it moved to, this was before, this was in, this, I'm not quite sure where this is. It might have been on the Champ de Mars. But it moved to the Porte de Versailles. And then gradually the Porte de Versailles developed more and more as a Parc des Expositions, which is what it is today. And here on the right, you see the Boulevard Périphérique. And here on the left, you see the Boulevard des Maréchaux. So this entire very wide span, 400 yards or more, all around the entire perimeter of Paris was opened up for development, which took place over decades. One of the first things built in that space is the Cité Universitaire, Cité Internationale Universitaire. This is where the Boulevard Périphérique now stands. And this is the Boulevard des Maréchaux. Please mute. That's where the Cité U is located, right next to the Parc Montsouris. So the Exposition Universelle of 1937, back on the Champ de Mars, although it's a narrower Champ de Mars. The Eiffel Tower is still there, but the Palais de Tokyo bit the dust, and it was replaced by the Palais De Chaillot. In front of the Palais De Chaillot, there were two pavilions of note facing off. On the left, you had the Nazi pavilion, and on the right, the Soviet pavilion, who are to meet again shortly. Would someone please mute? So once the fair was over, the pavilions were removed, and the Palais de Chaillot was converted into museum space. It currently houses the Cité de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine, the Musée de la Marine, and the Musée de l'Homme, along with the Théâtre de Chaillot.
Si tu as un défaut des plaques, c'est disjoncteur tout le temps. Si la plaque est morte, ça disjoncte tout le temps. Là, c'est pas le cas.
Also constructed for the 1937 exhibition was the Palais de Tokyo, which now serves as the Musée de l'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris. Jill, can you mute this person?
It's Andrew.
Oh, well, Andrew, please mute.
I'm calling him. I'm calling him.
Okay.
Oh, he's muted now. It's okay.
Okay.
Oh,
June.
no.
So now, shortly after the exhibition, the Second World War, German occupation began on June 14th,
Hi,
1940.
Andrew. It's me because earlier
6 days later,
you could hear.
a mere 6 days later,
Here I
Hitler made his one and only visit to Paris,
am. Okay now.
arriving at 6 in the morning, leaving a few hours later. He had a quick tour around Paris. His favorite building was the Opera. The Third Republic came to an end, and the Vichy government took over. The Hotel de Crillon served as the headquarters of the German High Command, and the Hotel Lutetia as the headquarters of the Abwehr, the German intelligence service. Again, not much construction, but there was demolition. Îlot Insalubre numero 16 was demolished. This is a picture of the 4th arrondissement, the Marais. This here is the Rue De Rivoli, which becomes the Rue Saint-Antoine. And when you visit the Marais, you are always impressed by the wonderful architecture north of the Rue Saint-Antoine, but oftentimes, if you go south of the Rue Saint-Antoine, you'll be surprised by how much modern architecture there is. And that's because that was where the Îlot numero 16 was located. So this shows the îlots. The green sections were owned by the city. The pink were going to be preserved, and there are not many of those. The yellow was going to be expropriated, and most of the yellow was demolished, as is reflected in this picture. The arrow points to the stretch along the Rue des Jardins Saint-Paul, which was demolished. And this rather cool photo shows a before and after. And once they demolished the buildings alongside that street, they discovered this 80 meters, 260 foot long stretch of the Philippe Auguste wall, by far the largest surviving remnant of the Philippe Auguste wall from 1200. Is Paris burning? Happily, General Cholitz disobeyed Hitler's order to burn Paris, and it survived. It was liberated by American and French troops. Charles de Gaulle famously walked down the Champs-Élysées braving sniper fire on August 26th. Paris was liberated. May 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. France was liberated. The war was over. The Trente Glorieuses began. And we will talk about the next 30 years after that, right up until today, next week, same time, same place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Russell.
Thank you, Russell.
Thank you. Thank you, Russell.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Russell.
Thank you.
Thank
Bravo,
you, Russell.
Russell.
Fabulous.
Fantastic.
Very good. Thank you, Russell.
You.